Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Friday, February 16th slate of college basketball DFS. Now, at the time of recording, we have a 4-game slate on DraftKings, and FanDuel is yet to post pricing for their slate if they have one. FanDuel's been pretty good about getting, daily college basketball slates out there. But so I hope they end up having a slate for Friday, February 16th. But if not, this is just for the DraftKings slate. I've been kind of on the track all season long, like, hey, like we need to support FanDuel college basketball DFS. That way DraftKings has some competition. And also, I do think that there's days where they do a better job of, pricing and, salary management as opposed to DraftKings. And sometimes they can post some pretty good contests as well. So don't be afraid to go try out FanDuel. And I'm saying all that on a slate where they might not even have one. So anyway, this Friday does bring us more of a back to our roots Friday slate. And what I mean by that is I've been saying all season long how last year years prior, we had a lot of mid-major Friday slates, right? Where we just had teams from conferences that didn't always get the spotlight, didn't always get on the main slates. And that was kind of their home on the Friday slates. Well, here on this Friday slate on DraftKings, we've got a little bit of a mid-major Friday slate. We've got a game in the Big East, which we normally see on main slates, but then we've got two A10 teams, and then a battle in the MAC, and then a battle in the Mountain West as well. So 4 games all featuring kind of different angles and different possibilities to attack, different ways that we can construct our DraftKings lineups on Friday night. In this episode, we are going to break down each game and tell you who you need to be targeting for your DFS lineups. Now, I'm going to go ahead and end the introduction right there so that we can go ahead and dive into game one. Remember, if you like what you see on YouTube, please hit the like button. It really does help me out a ton. And if you're listening on audio, please rate and review. I promise y'all those do not fall on deaf ears. It really does help me out, and I really do appreciate it when you guys do that. I cannot stress that enough. And then also make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube as well as the audio feed. We're closing in on 400 subscribers, and I really want to get to 500 before March Madness is over. So we can't get to 500 unless we get to 400 first. So help me out. Hit that subscribe button if you've not already. All right, let's go ahead and end the intro there. Let's go ahead and start talking about game number 1, VCU at St. Louis. So game number 1 is a battle in the A10 between VCU and St. Louis, and this is, if I must say so, it's not one of the best game environments of the slate, and I think this kind of has blowout written all over it because from what I've seen of these two teams, VCU is one of the best teams in the A10. St. Louis is not. And so I think this game does have a chance of getting ugly. KenPom has this one projected to be in favor of VCU 75-69. Surprised to see only a 6-point spread. The KenPom does generally factor in home court advantage at about 3 points-ish. So, you would think that the difference between these two teams would be about 9 points, with St. Louis getting a 3-point bump. Now, the reason why I think this might be a blowout is because the first game between these two teams was a blowout. VCU beat St. Louis at home 85-61, and that game got pretty ugly pretty quick. Now, from the VCU side, they're not a great offensive team. I'm not going to go out and make them sound like they are, but they have 3 guys that I feel pretty comfortable with contributing to their offense on a game-by-game basis. First of which is Max Shulga. I believe he is their best all-around player. He's just a solid, dependable floor general point guard who is normally pretty consistent in terms of his fantasy output. Put up 26 fantasy points against St. Louis in a game where he only played 32 minutes, was 4 for 10 from the field. He normally gets to his average of about 28 fantasy points. The Dayton game last time out, he was held to 14.5. But if you look at it, he was great in the peripheral stats. Just went 0 for 5 from the field. And, Dayton will do that to teams. Dayton's a really good defensive team. VCU only scored 49 points in that game. So I'm willing to kind of buy the dip on Max Shulga. I think this is a pretty good spot for him. If St. Louis can keep this game close enough that he plays 30-plus minutes, this could be a really good spot for Max Shulga because he has a chance to really put up a ton of peripheral stats. Now, Sean Bairstow is kind of similar in terms of his peripheral stats, right? Except he will get more rebounds than Shulga does. He's got a really good rebounding rate on the defensive side. But he really hasn't shown that much of a ceiling lately. In the last 5 games he's played, he hasn't topped 26 fantasy points. And you have to go back to the LaSalle game earlier in January to where he had 37 to get above 30. So I don't think he has necessarily a super high ceiling. He doesn't generally take double-digit shots. But, if this is a game environment where VCU is going to score, 80 points and he is out there on the floor a lot, he has a chance to get a lot of rebounds, a lot of assists, and a lot of points as well. So I definitely think he's playable, but he's not the first guy I would go to. I don't think he's going to be very highly owned, so he might be a nice, interesting little pivot off of Shulga or the next guy that we're going to talk about, Joe Bamisil. Joe Bamisil, I think on paper, is the best play for the VCU Rams. He leads the team in usage rate on the season, even though he comes off the bench. The only question is is he going to play enough minutes that even at that high of a usage rate, he scores a lot of fantasy points? Well, take a look back at the last St. Louis game. In that game, he only played 23 minutes, but he put up 42 fantasy points because he had over a 30% usage rate. He was 10 for 13 from the field in that game. So if he's able to be really good in this game like he was last game, he certainly has 40 fantasy point upside like he was able to do so in that game. And he's only at a salary of $5,700. There's a lot to like about Joe Bamisile. He is one of my favorite low to mid range value guards on this slate. I really think he's a solid play at 5,700. Now, Zeb Jackson, we've talked about before on the podcast, his splits with and without Sean Barstow are quite staggering. When Barstow is out of the lineup, he has his ceiling games. When Barstow is in, he doesn't do a whole lot. So he is probably a pass, in my opinion. Watching the Dayton game last Friday night, I had the impression that he was playing really well. He was 4 for 7 from the field, was doing a lot of good things for them, but it only ended in 17 fantasy points. He just doesn't have enough volume to get there with Sean Barstow's in the lineup. Now, VCU does play a 3 big rotation between Fermin, Kouani, and Lawal, and I don't like to pat myself on the back a whole lot, but I was kind of right about them last week. Like all 3 of them used their fouls against Deron Holmes in that game against Dayton, and all 3 of them kind of limit each other's upside because they all 3 kind of split minutes. Just from the eye test, I think Lawal is the best of the 3. He seems to be pretty consistent with his fantasy output, and it's not enough that I'm really willing to go to him at a salary of $4,800. Last time out against St. Louis, he played 21 minutes, put up 17 fantasy points on only 4 shots taken. Of the 3 bigs, he's the guy that I would be considering. Next up, I don't know if you guys heard that or not, but a piece of ice just fell from my fridge. That was kind of terrifying. Anyway, heading to the St. Louis side. They are a very interesting team to look at. Like I said, they are not one of the best teams in the A10, and they have really been searching for their rotation, searching for kind of what their best lineup is and what their best group is. So basically, Sincere Parker is the guy that leads the team in usage rate, and boy, does he put that usage to good use. Last 2 games, he's put up 49 and 52 fantasy points. He's been on fire in those 2 games. He's only needed 18 and 27 minutes to get to those, fantasy point totals. He plays off the bench, and when he's in, he is just jacking up shots. And I think you got to consider him for that reason, just because when he does play, he's going to have the ball in his hand. He does have legitimate 50 fantasy point upside. Now, in the previous game against VCU, he played 21 minutes, put up 14 shots in those 21 minutes, put up 30 fantasy points. And that was in a game that wasn't really all that close. So I think that Sincere Parker definitely has some legitimate upside. I think he's a GPP play, though, because, with him being a guy that comes off the bench, you just don't really know how much minutes you're going to get out of him. Gibson Jimerson feels like he's been at St. Louis forever. If you watch a lot of A10 basketball, he's a very shot-dependent guy for his fantasy total, and he just doesn't always get them. Like he's a solid player in real life, but from fantasy, like he just doesn't have enough volume that I can feel pretty comfortable playing him at a salary of $6,700. Bradley Ezewiro is probably I guess I could say this. I think he's their best all-around player from St. Louis, from what I have seen. He can have his ups and downs. He got into big-time foul trouble against St. Joe's. That's why he only played 14 minutes in that game. But he does have a track record of getting to 4x value in 3 of his last 6 games. At his current salary, that's not bad. Against VCU, he played 23 minutes and put up 17 fantasy points, which is not great. But I definitely see the ability for Ezewiro to hit value here on this slate. And there's not a whole lot of like mid-range price type of guys that I like on this slate. Terrence Hargrove Jr. is kind of like their small ball 4, and his fantasy totals are just up and down, right? You never really know what you're going to get from him. Last game against St. Joe's, when Ezewiro got in foul trouble, you saw a lot more offensive usage for Hargrove. He put up 12 shots, which is his first time taking double-digit shots since a month ago against VCU. And so Hargrove had 31 fantasy points in that game, but the last time he put up double-digit shots, again, the aforementioned game against VCU, only 14.5 fantasy points. So just not a whole lot to like at the top of the St. Louis side unless you're going to go for the upside of Sincere Parker. Now, one thing you will need to monitor, though, is that Mike Meadows Jr. is injured. It's a back injury. From what I've read, I don't think he's going to play this game, but it wouldn't shock me if he did suit up. But if he continues to be out, there are 2 guards who are really eating it up with him being out. The first of which is Larry Hughes II. Yes, that Larry Hughes has a son who is Larry Hughes II. And he's been pretty solid lately. In the 2 games that Mike Meadows missed, Hughes has put up 25 and 25 fantasy points in those 2 games. That's pretty solid for a salary of only $4,000. If we get confirmation that Meadows is out, he is one of my favorite value plays on the slate. Another one of them is Keanu Damian Medley, who I think you can play with or without Larry Hughes. He starts for St. Louis. And so you know that he's going to be out there for a decent amount of minutes. Unfortunately, he has had situations where like he starts the game and then comes out and like barely plays at all after that. But he did put up 13 fantasy points in the first game without Meadows. Last game against St. Joe's, played 18 minutes. Shot really wasn't falling and only put up 4 fantasy points in that game. I think Medley is a little pivot off of Hughes, and I do think that Hughes is going to carry a lot of ownership. So I think that Medley might be a sneaky little interesting value play. On paper, Hughes is a much better play, which is why, again, I think he's going to see a lot more ownership. But that's really for this St. Louis side. I think the only ways you can really attack it are by going with the upside of Sincere Parker, maybe Ezewiro in the mid-range, and then going for the value plays of Hughes or Medley. Now, the next game up is going to be Villanova at Georgetown, a battle in the Big East. This one, I think, also has serious blowout potential. This one is the widest spread on the slate. According to KenPom has this game 75-66 in favor of Villanova. And look, Georgetown just gets blown out by a lot of Big East teams. So it would not shock me if this game turned into a blowout. So with the concern for that being for VCU, though, is because they play at a slow tempo and because they're so balanced with their usage, if the game turns into a blowout, can any of these starters hit value? Well, Eric Dixon does have the highest usage rate on the season, but if you look back at his game log, like he does need to play 30 plus minutes if he wants to hit value. His last big game really was against Marquette, played 33 minutes and put up 36 fantasy points. So I definitely think he's a guy that you can play if you think the game is going to be close. But if you think it's going to be a blowout, I just don't think he's going to put up enough fantasy points per minute that he's going to hit value if he only plays 25 minutes. TJ Bamba and Tyler Burton are both shot-dependent wings. Look, I think they're solid GPP plays. They have upside, like they're good players. But again, kind of like with Eric Dixon, like they're going to have to play a lot of minutes, and their shots are going to have to be falling if you want them to hit value. What's really interesting for Villanova is that Mark Armstrong has been the usage leader among their guards in the last 2 weeks. Pretty much in 4 straight games, he has taken a lot of shots, 8 straight shots in 5 straight games now, 2 of which were in double digits. And he hasn't always shot the ball well, but he doesn't really need to hit value. At only $6,100, on a short slate like this with some not great game environments, we'll take 24 fantasy points, which he has hit 22 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4. I kind of like the idea of getting him as a high usage guard, but again, kind of like same thing with Dixon. We need him to play a full minute load if we want him to hit value. Now, what's been real interesting is that Mark Armstrong has really eaten up a lot of usage from Justin Moore, who I would have said was Villanova's best player coming into the season. And Moore just hasn't been great lately, hasn't gotten a lot of shots, hasn't put up a lot of peripheral stats, hasn't done a whole lot from a fantasy perspective. But if you trust and you truly believe in his talent that, hey, this is their best player, he's going to come back sooner or later, then you can play him on a slate like this and truly get value from him because Georgetown's defense is not good at all. And so, this could be a good Justin Moore bounce back spot. Now, after that, what I do think is interesting is when you go back and look at the game logs, you can see who for Villanova is good in blowout situations. And Hakeem Hart is really the first name that pops up in blowouts, kind of like the one against Seton Hall where he put up 22 fantasy points. He is pretty good when Villanova wins in a blowout. And you can look back, further back, and you can see that he does have some of these big games when Villanova wins by a lot. I think that's definitely worth noting, and I definitely think that he's a guy that you can go with if you think this game does turn into a blowout. 2 other guys that are that way would be Brandon Housen, who is seeing more and more minutes lately as he is playing very well for Villanova, 20 fantasy points in back-to-back games. Or you could even go with Lance Ware. There was much hype around Lance Ware transferring to Villanova, and he hasn't really done a whole lot, but every now and then he has these games where he plays double-digit minutes and he puts up some decent fantasy points. Like when Villanova beat DePaul by 25 points. He played 16 minutes, put up 20 fantasy points. Just a week ago, or really a little over a week ago against Providence, played 15 minutes, put up 18 fantasy points when Villanova won by 18. So there's definitely a window for Lance Ware to hit value at a salary of only $3,200. So that would be kind of what I'm thinking about Villanova is if you think the game's going to be close, you can go to the top and play Dixon or Armstrong. If you think the game's going to be a blowout, you got Hart, Housen, and Ware. And then kind of the low-owned GPP plays would be Bamba, Burton, and Justin Moore. Now, on the Georgetown side, they're a really tough team to target. They aren't projected to score a whole lot of points, so that generally makes them tough to target. But they have a guy who is a massive usage guy in Jaden Epps. He has over a 30% usage rate on the season. He has taken 18 or more shots in 7 of the last 9 games. which is just a crazy stat to think about. But really, I mean, somebody's got to shoot the ball for Georgetown, so why not Epps? And when the shot's falling, he's pretty good from a fantasy perspective. When the shot's not falling, he's really not. Villanova's a pretty good defensive team, though, and they're really going to slow the tempo down. So I don't think this is a great game environment for Epps, but he has shown the ability that even in blowouts, he's going to play a ton of minutes and he's going to jack up a ton of shots. So I do think there is a little bit of GPP viability for Jaden Epps at $7,100. Now, Supreme Cook is really coming on strong as the season has continued. He's seen over a 25% usage rate in the last 3 games, and he's put up 45, 24, and 37 fantasy points in those 3 games. You definitely have to consider a guy like Supreme Cook, considering Villanova is significantly undersized in the front court, in my opinion. Not from like a girth standpoint, but like we've seen bigs have good games by just shooting over the Villanova bigs. That is something that can happen. Dontrez Styles is a wing that I think he really needs his shot to fall to be good from a fantasy perspective. He put up 37 fantasy points twice in the last 2 weeks, but in both those games he made at least 3 3-pointers, took at least 16 total shots. So really, I think you could maybe get by with like a little Epps style stack and hope that the game stays close, hope that they're able to stay in and knock down their shots. I don't think that's a terrible strategy. Now, really, outside of those 3 guys for Georgetown, nobody's really super consistent offensively for him. Jay Heath has been playing a ton of minutes, but hasn't really done a whole lot with it from a fantasy perspective. He has not been over 4x value at his current salary in the last 6 games. So not exactly what we want there. Rowan Brumbaugh, however, is a guy that was starting for them and now comes off the bench. And he's a guy that gets extended run and blowouts. And in 3 of the last 4 games, he's put up at least 15 fantasy points in a game where Georgetown has gotten blown out. So I definitely think there's something there. If you think that this is going to be a blowout, you can play a guy like Brumbaugh. You could do the same concept with Wayne Bristol or Drew Fielder. I think both those guys are also guys that would see extended run in blowouts for the Hoyas. All right, so that does it for the first 2 games. Let's take a quick breather and then let's talk about the nightcap. Now on to game number 3. We've got some action on a Friday night between Ohio and Toledo, and y'all, do not sleep on this game. This is the best game environment of the slate. KenPom has this one projected to finish as 83-78 in favor of Toledo for a 161-point total, which would probably be the highest on like a 12-game slate, unless we've got like, I don't know, maybe Alabama on that slate. But this is a really high total, and this is a game that you need to be targeting. It is the highest total on the slate, according to KenPom, by 9 points. And we actually have like verification that this game should be a shootout. Toledo won the original meeting between these 2 teams 86-77. So there was 163 points scored in that game. So there is definitely a chance that we're going to see some prolific scoring in this one. Both of these 2 teams rank outside of the top 250 in defensive efficiency on KenPom, and both are either 102nd or better offensively. I wanted to say top 100, but one of them was 102, so I made it top 102. Sue me. So anyway, Ohio is an interesting team to target. What you do have to monitor is that they currently have an injury to Sharif Mitchell. I kind of combined injury and Mitchell there. They have an injury to Sharif Mitchell. He did not play in their last game. However, what's interesting is he had a lot of success in the first game against Toledo, putting up 24 fantasy points on 16 real points. But you can't play him, obviously, if he's out. What you saw in the last game was Elmore James got the start in place of Mitchell, and he was the ultimate member of the cardio club. He played 33 minutes in that game, only shot the ball 1 time, and only put up 3.75 fantasy points. What's really weird, though, is like, that's not typical of what James has done over the course of the season, but it is typical of what James has done over the last 2 to 3 weeks. On the season, he has a 19% usage rate, and he has been a starter in this lineup for Ohio before. In fact, in the original game against Toledo, he started, played 34 minutes, and put up 29 fantasy points. So I have no idea what happened to Elmore James. This is one of the strangest statistical profiles I have seen when doing my DFS research in the last 2 years. And I don't know what to make of it. Like, I think he's an interesting GPP play, especially if Mitchell is out and he gets to start again. But like, I don't know what has happened to his usage and his shot rate. Like, it's like his teammates haven't been passing him the ball the last 2 weeks for whatever reason. Now, Ohio does have a very clear best player, though, and that is Jalen Hunter. He has a 27% usage rate on the season, 33% in their last game against Arkansas State, put up 39 fantasy points in that game. Worth noting because that was when Sharif Mitchell was out, and it would stand the reason that if Sharif Mitchell continues to be out, that you would see more continued usage from Jalen Hunter. Well, in the game against Toledo the first time, Hunter did not have a good showing. He only put up 17 fantasy points on 28 minutes, which neither of which are typical for him. He also wasn't dealing with foul trouble in that game, which I thought was interesting. So just an off night for him. But he's been great recently. He's put up 39 fantasy points in 4 straight. With a guy with this high of a ceiling and this level of usage in this game environment, I think he's an absolute smash play, $8,500. And I hope that people see the previous game against Toledo and stay away from him. But I think that was more of an aberration than a sign of things to come. Now, second and third on the team in usage are AJ Clayton and Aiden Hadaway. They kind of like, I don't know. They're like any team that plays two bigs. Like they kind of alternate good games. I think Clayton has a little bit more of a solid floor, considering he gets a little more shots up. Hadaway is not as safe, but he does have as high of a ceiling. Put up 38 fantasy points against Ball State, 35 against Kent State. In the previous game against Toledo, Hadaway was not successful, only putting up 14 fantasy points, and Clayton was not a whole lot better, only putting up 15 fantasy points. So not the best matchup for these two guys. I would probably rather pay up for Jalen Hunter if I'm going to play one of the expensive guys on Ohio. Now, after them two, Miles Brown as well as AJ Sheldon are kind of just these inconsistent guards that like every now and then they'll have a ceiling game and every now and then they'll just give you not much at all. I think Brown is about $600 overpriced on DraftKings. If he were about $5,500, I'd be much more inclined to play him. Sheldon is interesting because he did have a really good game without Sharif Mitchell in the lineup last time against Arkansas State. So if we get news that Sharif Mitchell is going to be out again, I definitely think that Elmore James and AJ Sheldon are certainly in play. But with this being a supreme game environment, I definitely want to try to get some exposure to this Ohio side, and that'll most likely be with Jalen Hunter. Now, on the Toledo side, they have a clear big three. We have seen this team on slates before, and that big three is Raheem Moss, Dante Maddox, and Tyler Cochran. And look, all three of them are good players, and all three of them were really good from a real life perspective against Toledo, but it didn't really transfer to a whole lot of fantasy points. You look back in the box score against that previous game against Ohio, Raheem Moss had 29 fantasy points, which is solid but unspectacular. Dante Maddox was a little bit worse, 24.75. But Tyler Cochran actually had the best fantasy performance out of all of them. He put up 34 fantasy points in that game against Ohio. I think that this matchup shapes up the best for Cochran out of all of them. Ohio is a really poor rebounding team, and out of the big three guards, Tyler Cochran is the best rebounder of them. They're also really bad at defending the two-point shot, of which Tyler Cochran takes the most proportional amount of two-point shots. So I love all three of the big three guards for Toledo, Moss, Maddox, and Cochran, but I do think that on paper, the matchup sets up the best for Cochran, and that evidenced itself out in their last performance against Ohio. Now, a guy that I really do like also is Javon Simmons. He is playing the center position for this Toledo squad. He is really their only big, and he has been really good recently. Last 6 games, he's been over 26 fantasy points 4 times. I messed that stat up. I was going 4 for 5, and then I changed it to last 6. He's been over 26 fantasy points in 5 of the last 6 games, showing a 35-point ceiling last time out against Appalachian State. Look, I just think Javon Simmons, I think he's really good. I think he's going to be really good for this Toledo team in the future too, and he's at a really good price point at $6,600. The last game they played against Ohio, he put up 14.5 fantasy points, but I kind of think that was due a little bit to the fact that he was dealing with foul trouble. I didn't have a chance to see exactly when he picked up his fouls, but I do know he ended the game with 4 fouls and only played 25 minutes, which is not like him. So with Toledo being a poor rebounding team and poor at defending the two-point shot, I think this matchup sets up really well for Javon Simmons if he is able to stay on the floor. Now, Sonny Wilson is kind of like the fourth wheel at the guard spot, if there is such a thing. He can have big games like he did against Appalachian State last week, putting up 30 fantasy points, but he can also disappear for entire games. The last time out against Ohio, he put up 22 fantasy points, so he's definitely worth a look. And then after that, you've got the backup center, Lawrenson, who I do think is an intriguing play at $3,800. He is a really big guy, and he does have a chance to put up some fantasy points if he does get minutes. You just never really know how many minutes he's going to get. I would not play him and Simmons together, but that's really the only guys that are really big-time rotation pieces. Sam Lewis will play a little bit as well, but Toledo gives so many minutes to those big three guards, and really Javon Simmons and Sonny Wilson eat up a ton of the minutes also. So just not really a whole lot of bench options, but I definitely think with this being a great game environment, you're going to want to get exposure to at least one of these Toledo guys Friday night. Last game of the night is going to be New Mexico taking on San Diego State, and this one is projected to finish 78-74 in favor of San Diego State. So this is a real interesting game because the rematch went the original meeting went the other way. This is a rematch. In the original meeting, New Mexico won 88-70, which was big, right? Like that's a big win for New Mexico. What's most interesting though is that Donovan Dent, their point guard, might end up missing this game. He did suffer an ankle injury against Nevada. He did not return to that game. And ankle injuries, you never really know what's going to happen with them. Like sometimes it's one of those things where if he warms up and it feels good, he ends up playing. Sometimes it's one of those things where he could miss 2 to 3 weeks. You never really know what's going to happen. But I kind of want to go over all scenarios. If Dent does not play this game, then what you have seen over the last 2 seasons when they've all been together is that Jalen House and Jamal Mashburn Jr. will see incredibly big usage boosts if Dent ends up missing. House has been New Mexico's usage leader on the season. He has been a super consistent fantasy scorer on the season. And the last game out against San Diego State, he put up 50 fantasy points. There is a lot to like about Jalen House at a salary of only $7,800, especially if Dent is out. Jamal Mashburn Jr. is only $5,800, but like, if Donovan Dent is out, I kind of think that he can like shatter that price tag, right? Like last season, he was not at this range very often. And, this season he hasn't been great in conference play, hasn't really done a whole lot, but like it's been because of the development of Donovan Dent. And it's been because his shot hasn't really been falling. Like he's had some 3 for 15s and some 4 for 10s. So if we do get Donovan Dent out, I think Jamal Mashburn is going to be a really solid volume based play at only $5,800. Now, after those two, Nelly Jr. Joseph is a guy that I am not going out of my way to play. San Diego State's really tough on the interior. It's just not a great matchup. And even in a game where New Mexico scored 88 points, he only put up 24 fantasy points in that game against San Diego State. Hard pass for me there. JT Toppin is an interesting one, though. He played really well the last time out against San Diego State, putting up 53 fantasy points. And here's the kicker. He was 1 for 10 from the foul line in that game. So if he just shoots 60%, 6 for 10, he ends up with 58.5 fantasy points. That is just incredible. So I think he's a guy that has a lot of upside. And again, kind of like with Jalen House, there's a lot to like about those two, given that they're taking on San Diego State in a rematch where they absolutely lit them up the first time, and they might see boosted usage if Donovan Dent is out. Now, after that, Mustafa Amzil is a Dayton transfer who plays off the bench that I've always really liked his game. He's a really natural scorer. He can shoot the three as well, and he's a good rebounder. Against San Diego State, the last time he put up 19 fantasy points in 19 minutes, but he's playing more minutes than that now. I think he's an interesting value play at only 5,100. Not one of my favorites on the slate. I'd probably rather play one of the Ohio Toledo guys, but definitely a name to look out for and a guy that has GPP viability. And then you also have Jamarl Baker, who I believe would get the start if Donovan Dent misses. In the game earlier this season that Donovan Dent missed, he did get the start, but that was against a Division II opponent, and Baker only put up 14 fantasy points in that game. So not exactly the best precedent, but I do think he would be a guy that would get a spot start if Dent was out. And at only $3,400, that's very interesting. If they did not start Baker, it would probably be because they started True Washington. They seem to like Washington coming off the bench, though, and he does get more usage than Baker when they come off the bench together. But I don't think he would necessarily fit as well into the starting lineup as Baker would. But if they do end up starting Washington at only $5,000, he's definitely got to be in consideration. Now, on the San Diego State side, look, we've had this team before. We kind of know what the deal is. Jaden Ledee is their usage leader and their usage leader and their best player on the season. He has a super high ceiling. He just hasn't hit it in a long, long time. Last time out against New Mexico, he did end with 26.5 fantasy points, but he was 6 for 15 from the field. So, like, the usage is there, the ability is there. It's just a matter of him putting it all together and having a good game, which I do think he has an opportunity to do so in this game at home against New Mexico. Now, the guards for them, like, man, I just never know what to do with them. You've got Butler, Parrish, Trammell, and Waters, and they're all good players. Like, I'm not like hating on any of them, but they're just really annoying from a fantasy perspective because their usage tends to be pretty even. Their fantasy scoring tends to be pretty even. There's never really anything from a fantasy perspective that makes me want to lean one guy over the other. And it's just a really tough situation to target. With this being a great game environment, if you're playing 20 max lineups, in a 20 max tournament, can you sprinkle in all four of them? Yeah. Would I play more than one of them in the same lineup? Heck no. I play one of them and hope that that's the one guy that goes off. And if you're single entry, like if you're playing a single entry tournament, I'm probably not putting any of them in a single entry team just because I don't think there's a whole lot of security in any of them. Now, in the last game against New Mexico, the order was Parrish and then Ledee and then Trammell in terms of usage for the top three. However, when it comes to Micah Parrish, he was not successful with that usage. He did only put up 12 fantasy points in that game against New Mexico. He did foul out in only 17 minutes played. So he had the usage when he was out there, but it's not like he was very successful with it. Darion Trammell would probably be a guy that I would consider the most out of these San Diego State guards. I just think he's more of a gifted scorer. He's got a high assist rate, and you could look at a situation where maybe you could compare Trammell with Ledee and hope that his assists kind of lead with Ledee buckets. I think that's probably not a bad way to look at it. And then Reese Waters tends to rack up some peripheral stats. If you think this game shoots out, I don't think he's a bad option. But again, there's just not really a whole lot of security in any of them. Reese Waters last time out against New Mexico only put up 20 fantasy points. Now, after that, Jay Powell is kind of usurping Elijah Saunders off the bench in terms of minutes, but I think Powell's price tag is a little too rich for my blood. And then Micah Bird is a guard that plays off the bench for them that you never really know what he's going to do, but one of his best games of the season came against New Mexico where he put up 22 fantasy points in that spot. All right, so that does it for all four games of the Friday night slate, and that does it for this episode. So hopefully was able to give you guys plenty of information that you need to help build some winning lineups here on this Friday night slate. If you like what you saw, please do me a favor on YouTube, hit the like button. It really does help me out. I really do appreciate it. If you're listening on audio, rate and review the podcast. Again, I cannot stress this enough. It helps me out so much, and I really do appreciate when you guys do that. If you want to show me a little bit of support, help me out a little bit, that is one way you could do so, absolutely free of charge. And also subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the audio feed. We're closing in on 400 subscribers. I really want to get to 500 before March Madness. Now, in terms of like the schedule, I hope to be back tomorrow night. I'm not going to make any promises because my 5-month-old daughter is sick. Fortunately, she's having a good night sleeping so far, and I'm really crossing my fingers on that. I hope to be back tomorrow night, but if it's not a good night, then it probably won't be back talking about the Saturday slate. But if you ever want more information from me, whether it's a slate that I'm talking about here on a podcast or not, there's a few places where you can get that. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. Join the Fantasy Corner Discord. I'm a firm believer that we have the best Discord in all college basketball DFS. And we've got a lot of smart minds, a lot of good people in there also. They're just talking plays, talking strategy all day long for college basketball. Some days are more active than others, but for the most part, where they're active for every slate. And you got a lot of people to bounce ideas off of and talk strategy and talk game. And it's just a blast to be a part of and to sweat it out together as well. And so if you're looking for people to talk in DFS with, not just for college basketball, to other sports as well, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube as well as on audio. And then I do write a full article to my Patreon for every college basketball slate. I profile all of my core plays as well as kind of my lineup strategy and attack strategy from the slate. So if you heard the full gamut of information for this episode and you want to know who actually makes my lineups, the Patreon is the place where you can do that. That one is $3 a month, but there's not a whole lot of people out there doing it for college basketball. And if you're just looking for a way to support me, that's a great way to do it because that finances a lot of the data that I get, kind of put these shows together, so like the stuff like the usage rates and stuff like that, it's not free. So, people paying the Patreon does allow me to finance that information to get it back out to you guys. All right. So that does it for this episode, y'all. Like I said, hope to be back Friday night, hope to be back Friday night to record the Saturday episode, I should say. But if I'm not, you guys know where you can find me. But other than that, hopefully I was able to give you guys what you need to build some winning lineups here on this Friday slate. Best of luck to you guys on the Friday slate. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you next time.